Thank you for being here. I would like to welcome you to an exhibition that means a lot to all of us, an exhibition that really is very special, and to do the honor our adjunct curator and the person who worked, and she will give you the whole story of the project, Patricia, McAndrew.
Thank you. Now I know why they wanted a 40-foot timeline. It was so everybody could get a seat when it came today. But this project is very special to me, and I will introduce the people involved in it as we go along. But it dawned on me, I hadn't really heard the name AWA until several years ago. And then when Ken Rainier, the author of the book AWA, A Living Legacy, when he kept saying to me, he was working on a project about the E.P. Wilbur family, and he would say, I keep running into the name of an architect named AWA. I wonder if there's anything about this man. And so he would keep bringing this up, and I said to him, you know, an interest in a subject can stay in your mind forever, but once you put it down on paper or put it into another medium, you'll find it takes on a life of its own. So I encouraged him, please go ahead and just put anything down on paper. So he came to me a couple weeks later, he said, you're going to love what I did. He held up this little lateral shaped book, and he said, look at this. And there was the genesis of what has grown into an almost 300-page book. And I said to him, now the second thing is, once you put the idea down on paper, never leave home without taking the book. I said to him, I'm going to keep telling you and telling you and telling you, this is your mother speaking, and I said, always carry a little bag, but keep it with you, keep it in your car. You never know when the opportunity to do something with it is going to come about. So through our friend, through Tina Bradford, the journalist, we found out there was going to be an AWA birthday party. And Tina sent an email to the journalist Joan Campion. Joan called me at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, you're not going to believe it, there's going to be a birthday party for Lay. And I said, who died at 3 o'clock when somebody calls you? That was the last thing I wanted to hear. But anyway, Ken, she waited till 8 o'clock in the morning to call Ken, and she said, there's going to be a party for Lay. So the two of us crashed a party at Ombre Studio Inc. at 310 West Broad Street. And Ken, they were saying, we really wish there was something, since this is a Lay design building, we wish there was some way that we could have something that we could give out or sell in the gallery. And Ken said, well, as it happens, I'm working on a book about Lay. And Evelyn Beckman, the owner, said, really? And he said, yes, I have it with me. And he pulled out his little mock-up. Well, one thing led to another, and within a relatively short time, by the end of 2007, we had what we call the AWA project. And it was a privately commissioned study to assess what Lay buildings were around and to put together something that could be sold to tell people what kind of work he had done. Believe me, ignorance is truly bliss, because we started out with the idea that there were perhaps 24 Lay buildings in the area. Well, we ended up documenting at least 240. And Christine Usler, the architect, who was most helpful to us in our project, said that there are many more that simply haven't been written about yet. So we know it's well over 250. And in the course of his research, Ken examined over 3,000 Lay-related documents held primarily by the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And somehow they got this wonderful cache of Lay-associated treasures, and it was just a miracle. As Ken has said, it's sort of as though Lay was channeling us, because all of the people who had Lay properties were so nice. They literally said to us, take our building, please, come in, document it. They could not have been more gracious. And within just a year or a year and a half after the book's publication, Some of the buildings are gone, as is the case with Brockville, the former junior high school, and some of the buildings have changed hands. Their configuration inside is entirely different. Some are up for sale. Lay's own home has been sold within the past maybe 6 months. So you never know. We were able to capture the things just in time. And I have to thank our two wonderful photographers. Ken said the minute he knew the project, that he wanted to do the project, he said, I know the people I want to work with. I've got to get my team out there. And this was in the winter. And people tend to forget that when you're photographing architecture, flowers, flowering trees, and shrubs are not friendly. So you've got to do it in a very short season when the tree branches don't obscure the buildings themselves. So he said, I want Robert Walsh and John Kish IV, with whom I've worked before, to go out with me. We've got to do the stuff now. And I said, but Ken, we don't have the funding. And they were gracious enough to say, look, we'll do it on spec until you know if you do, but we've got to get the things done now. So we're very lucky. Robert Walsh is with us today. Robert, would you like to? One of our photographers. And John Kish's work is well represented, but today he was not able to be here. So I thought this would be a very good place to start. And what is really nice is, as Ricardo said, he's kind of been the godfather to this project from the outset, because I spoke to him about it, and so did Ken. And it was he who came up with the idea for the wonderful book cover, where he said, this man was a practicing architect. Why not take him, try to put him in the world in which he functions on a daily basis, so you don't see on the cover just the finished buildings, you actually see how the design process worked. So thank you very much, Ricardo. What you see is, again, a team effort. And as I said when I started, this is a very personal project for me, because I think, I don't know, is John from around here? From the area, John Kish?
Yes, he grew up.
Oh, okay. I said, I spent a lot of my life in lay buildings without even knowing it. I attended Holy Infancy Parochial School for 8 years, and then my family banked in what was the Wilbur Trust Company building, and there I spent so much of my childhood looking out my attic window at the church roof lines, one on 4th Street and one down 4th Street, and I can't even imagine life without lay skylines. So I was looking at things I had seen all my life, and Ken was viewing them as an outsider who had a non-architect who was in love with architecture. So I think to start down here, I wanted to come up to the timeline first. Ken created this at Ricardo's invitation to kind of orient people. Our theme going in was this year marks the 150th anniversary, the commemoration of the American Civil War. And so much of what we see in South Bethlehem particularly was the result of the energy the veterans brought back with them. To start with our subject, Albert Wolfring Lay was born in Easton. He was one of the youngest of 11 siblings. He was born in Williams Township in September 1848. So the Civil War begins. He was educated and worked on, he was educated in the Easton District. He worked on the family farm, but when the war broke out, he went to Philadelphia and joined the 198th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and it was the last of 6 regiments raised under the auspices of the Union League of Philadelphia. And what I find really interesting is some of the companies in this regiment were sent to the Army of the James under General Benjamin Butler, but as luck would have it, Lay's company, because his colonel pushed and pulled political strings, Lay's company was one of those sent to the legendary Army of the Potomac just in the closing months of the Civil War, down around Petersburg, Virginia. As it happened, he was in his group was in the 5th Corps, and they were under General Warren. Some of you who've been to Gettysburg know the statue of Warren. looking out over the valley, and also under Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. 16-year-old Lay was one of the men in Company C of the 198 who went through these battles around Petersburg, White Oak Swamp, Hatcher's Run, the Weldon Railroad, and at Hatcher's Run he sustained an injury to his right instep, and he, according to what his obituary says, he did not leave the line of battle. He reported for duty, even though he could have gone to the rear. So to me that shows a lot of what his character was like. He seems to have been a self-starter from the outset. So after the war, he returned to Easton, and instead of going on to college, he decided on a trade, and he chose wood carving. And with that in mind, he moved down to Durham, and he went to a man named Samuel Steckel. And for 2 years, he worked as an apprentice wood carver under Steckel, and at that time, apparently began to study books of architecture. He then moved on by the late 1860s to what was rapidly becoming the growing borough of South Bethlehem. On the timeline here, you will see in 1865, actually it's just around the time Lehigh University was founded, and I'm happy to say that today Lehigh probably has in its possession more lay-associated buildings than any other private institution. At last count, I think there were about 11 buildings that he had something to do with in terms of alterations or design on the greater Lehigh campus. So 1865, South Bethlehem is incorporated as a borough, and around the time of the Civil War, South Bethlehem had just under 1,000 people living over here in the separate borough. It was not the city of Bethlehem. That doesn't happen until 1918. But by the time 1890 came, the population in South Bethlehem had grown 10 times what it was. There were just over 10,000 people living here. So you can imagine, the newspaper said toward the end of the Civil War that if you wanted any woodwork, paper hanging, building done on the north side of the river, it would be hard to find somebody to do it because most of the tradesmen's work was being done on the south side. So 1865, the lay isn't quite here yet, but the borough is getting ready for one of the booms that it experienced over the years. Here you can see, let's see, around 1865. By 1869 or 70, A.W. Lay has settled in South Bethlehem, and from what we can find, he was living at 323 New Street in South Bethlehem. And I don't know if I haven't explored whether the numbers have changed over the years, but it would be around where Pat's newsstand is, and right next to the little dry cleaners as you go down South New Street right now. And he lived there by 1884, had married a young woman, Alice Rutten, and she was from the neighborhood, but the two of them settled in the area. He went to work in the large planing mills down around 2nd Street, and he established an office there, and eventually it was the Ritter and Beck planing mill, and by the time about in the 1870s, he had amassed enough money to be able to become a partner in the firm of Ritter, Beck, and Lay. So we've now come through the 1870s. Around 1888, this is what the reason the buildings are here is because they mark epochs in his work. And this is today the Ombre Studios at 310 West Broad Street. This is how it looked around 1907. But the building, as you can see, has some of the trademark Lay elements of little finials, and he loves his little pediments, and you'll see those again. You can see here. And this picture is from Lay's own business prospectus from around 1898. And it's the building that is today the Landmark Commons over on Main Street, only this whole top has been taken off. And it looks so different because when you see how beautiful the sets of windows are, and it directs the eye upward, there's a certain gracefulness about the building that looks very truncated when you see it today. So we can see here, this is another one of the milestones in South Bethlehem and Bethlehem's history, the smallpox epidemic in 1882. And it wiped out the families of, or the parents in some cases, of many of the workers in the Bethlehem Iron Company. And W.W. Thurston, the head of the company, realized this, and in very short order, he and his friends put together an orphanage that was aimed at taking care of the children who had been left homeless. AWA, over the years, worked on several different versions of the orphanage, which eventually became Wiley House and is today known as Kids Peace. So it's not impossible. We haven't gotten it for certain, but it's possible that two of Lay's children died in the smallpox epidemic, so it may have been a very personal work that he did on the orphanage. Over here is what people will recognize now as it's the old Orrs building, and in its restored state, it was the Beehive at this time. But again, it's got some more tradition. It's amazing that the building survived as well as it did underneath all of the facade that was there when it was Orrs. So let's see, that's by the 1890s. Lay did, as you will see when we get over to the photographs, Lay did, in the course of his life, 41 churches, 31 schools. He was known particularly for his church architecture. But this is a wonderful picture. Anyone who knows Comenius Hall at Moravian College will recognize that this is without the library, it's without Borheck Chapel on this side, but Lay designed the whole complex, the refectory that went around the back, even the landscaping was designed. And when the building was dedicated in 1892, the fathers of the college, the theological seminary, recognized what the piles of stone and what the arches and the design meant when they said that there were no sins of omission or commission on the part of the architect, because they felt that it exemplified the solidity and nobleness of learning, and they were very well pleased with the design. Here, some of you may recognize the First Reformed Church on West 4th Street, just across from the Blue Sky Cafe and down the street from the Home Base Skate Shop. And this church, it had a wonderful dome on it at the time of its construction. And I was always told when I was a child that the dome had been struck by lightning and it was simply never replaced. But that building you can see now. This is a building. I was taken there every time it was open when I was a child. It's one of my earliest memories, as it is for many people from South Bethlehem. And Ken says that this is one of the buildings for which the most complete set of elevations and drawings exists. This was the city market and municipal building, and Lay's plans, he retained the full set of plans, I guess, throughout his career, and this even showed what the rooms were going to be used for. He usually is very specific in his details. And around at the turn of the century, we had the physics building, and you can still see it. This is one of my very favorite buildings, but there was a terrible fire. And after the fire, Lay and a young man named Herman Schneider, to whom I'll refer later, received the contract to redesign the new physics building. And when you see the plans, everything on there is labeled fireproof, fireproof, fireproof. I mean, to an architect, fire was his worst enemy. Some of the buildings were destroyed even before they were completed. We can't really have any idea of how dangerous it was. And this one in particular...
Comenius Hall burn.
Yeah, Comenius Hall burn, but that was around 1912 or 13. So this is around the turn of the century, and it had been loaded with beautiful yellow pine. And I'm sure the pine and the varnish went up like nothing you've ever seen. People from the town, the fire engines couldn't even get up. There was no Taylor Street. They had to come up the hill. They couldn't find enough horses to drag the engines up. But there are pictures of people who came on their bicycles, and they're spread out on the lawns watching the fire burn. This was entertainment, like going to an execution in Europe years ago, centuries before. Lay did as many residences as he did, more actually, as he did churches and schools. And the residences have fared pretty well. There are quite a few of those, as we'll see when we get over to the pictures. And this may be familiar to some older Lehigh alumni, because many of Lay's mansions in the Delaware Avenue, Fountain Hill district, became fraternities in the late 1930s and 40s. And I've heard people say, oh yeah, I had my first date there. They don't recognize this as being the home. This was the home of Elijah Packer Wilbur Jr. and his wife. It was built for them. And it's one of the loveliest homes, and the plans are so complete that Ken was actually able to take the plans and to take them to the then owners of the building and show them exactly what the house had looked like. You see, I don't think he ever found a Palladian window that he didn't like. He's got them all over the place in his buildings. But with architecture, this period, as far as Lay was concerned, it was all about light. He loved windows, whether it was stained glass or plate glass. You see a lot of that in his work. Centenary this year, and Ken has something very special he's going to share with you, so I'll let him do that in a minute. In another two residences, side by side, over in the, after Fountain Hill ceased to be the residence of choice for the entrepreneurs and their families, many of Charles Schwab's junior executives moved over to the Prospect Avenue and Market Street area. These are two homes side by side, same period, and when you look at them compared with something like the E.P. Wilbur Jr. house, to me what the blueprints and elevations revealed is the lifestyle that the people live. These homes, while they're large, there is a certain relaxation to me of the formal kind of living. You might have had a housekeeper and maybe a maid or two. Some of these places required maybe 10 servants, and the whole way of living had changed by the time the next jump from this area would be out to Saucon Valley, but by that time Lay was deceased. And this, by many people, is considered to be his masterpiece. And Ricardo was telling us that just the other day there was an architect from China who specializes in traditional frame buildings, and Ricardo brought him to the exhibition, and what did he say? He understood what was going on in this building.
Yeah, he felt that later on was used, but some of the classical lines that he used was very innovative, especially
the
on the windows and that. It was a total, different thing for that period.
Right.
For that beginning, the second decade of the 20th century. Yeah. And
this was finished around 1917, and this was Brockle High School. Actually, it was the South Bethlehem High School when it was built, 1915 to 17. And what I found so interesting was that it was very symbolic, because it was the first time the children of many of the immigrants who had come into South Bethlehem could actually go to school, stay in school, and not work in a factory. They could complete 4 years of education. When this building was opened, the Civil War veterans brought it the flag. They came up the hill in a parade to give the flag to the people who would be opening the school as in tribute to the Union they had helped to restore. So this lasted till 2009, and now you can see there's a new brothel down the street. Lay himself remained very active in community affairs, and he joined the GAR in 1877. That was the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization. He headed their parades, he headed the ox roasts, he drilled the Cleveland and Hendricks marching band in the election year of 1884. This man was into everything. Every Friday night, the GAR met at the First National Bank building. He was into with the Knights of Malta, Knights of Pythias, all of the, and especially the Elks. This was one of the fraternal organizations that were replacing a lot of the old village and community and religious sentiment that people had grown up with. And he also had an office in Allentown. When times got tough, if you look on here, you will see around 1873 we had a great panic, but then in 1893 came a major depression. And Lay had to lay off a large part of his working force because, if it sounds familiar, architects were not in great demand when all of the building trade shut down during the recession. And he went into business in Allentown with Lair, Colonel Samuel Lair, the Allentown mayor, and a man named Martz, who incidentally designed Symphony Hall. And you can kind of see Lay-like echoes in the design for Symphony Hall, but some of his finest work, I think, was done during the 2 or 3 years during which he was with the firm of Lair, Lay, and Martz. Well, he continued to cooperate with people like Rue and Lang architects, and they did Muhlenberg. I believe they did the rotunda at Muhlenberg. And in 1918, he was on his way to consult with them in Allentown, and he was hurrying to catch a streetcar to go to the next city, and he told the people in his office that he didn't feel very well. And he still got on the trolley car. It's incredible that Ken was able to find a postcard of this. He got off at the terminus at 8th and Hamilton Streets, and as he got off the trolley car, he staggered and fell. And a man in the nearby firehouse saw this, ran out, picked him up, got 2 more men, and they carried him into the basement. This was the transit company's office. And he died before the ambulance from Allentown Hospital could get there. But in his pockets, they found his identification. So whether he died from a heart attack or the Spanish flu or a combination of the two isn't known. But it's very interesting that his death was a shock to the Holy High Valley. People flocked to his Pawnee Street home, which is still there. And there was a quartet of men singing hymns the next afternoon, and the neighbors came for 2 or 3 hours. People sent flowers, and he's buried over in Niskey Hill Cemetery, and the Elks conducted their ritual at his graveside. So this was somebody who was so bound up with the community. And what is interesting also is that you can see he designed for the entrepreneurs, but he also designed, as Tina Bradford has pointed out several times, he designed the cross-class lines. There are wonderful drawings of little apartment houses he did for people like the bricklayer Angelo Angiri up on 7th Street. Some of those little buildings behind Zollner, they look like mini apartments when you go out the back road. That's what it looks like when you see the actual blueprints. So he was designing bowling alleys for a man named Paul Ambrose on East 3rd Street. These people lived over the store. He did storefronts. He must have had boundless energy, that's all I can say. But I think that to me the most important thing is it's not just bricks and mortar, it's what does architecture do? I was telling somebody I had watched a couple of movies within the last few weeks, that have architecture as one of the stars. And in one case, the director in his commentary said, I searched for a building that would contain the exact feelings of the characters I was trying to represent. He said, I wanted a very modern building that was cold and sterile, and that you had the feeling was penning in the woman whose story this was. So I started thinking about Lay's buildings. What do they reflect to us? I think that's one reason I really liked them as a child, because growing up there was a certain comfort in the rosy brick and stone. They were very solid. You have the feeling these people built them to last. And also I was very fond of a quotation that one of our other townsmen, the American writer Stephen Vincent Benet, I think he expresses it very well if we really stop to think about it. How many times do you walk along and somebody says, where were you when this happened? If you imagine you're in Photoshop and you just take out everything behind you, how would you locate yourself? How would you describe an experience to somebody? And I love what Benet wrote to his wife after becoming engaged to her in 1921. He said to Rosemary, would you prefer to have been first kissed in the little old back street in Paris outside of a bar, an Italian restaurant, or a printing plant? I stood there in the rain this morning like a fool trying to decide which it was. He said the first two would have some meaning, but the Italian restaurant, I can't figure it out. So if you imagine all the people over the years who have gone through these buildings, have had experiences there, that to me is what architecture is all about. It's about life, and Lay's architecture is very human scale. Even his skyscraper, even his heavy buildings have the feeling that people can walk into them and have experiences there. It's a much different world, but these were considered very modern when they were put up. So if you'd like to go now, we can see what the photographers have said. Oh, sorry, excuse me, I forgot. No, sorry. Oh,
You can't forget the author.
I can't forget it, okay.
Author.
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking over there.
That's okay. Ken Rainier, for all those who like to know who I am and why I'm here. How are you? I'm going to take real quick, so we can get on our tour, focus on the E.P. Wilbur Trust building. And of course, we know it had many lives as different banks, from E.P. Wilbur Trust Company to Meridian to Wachovia to Union Bank, and now Wells Fargo. So the building remains, but the tenants come and go. But that's great because it's still alive and well, and it's functioning as it should. When we take the tour of looking at the photos, you'll be able to see exactly what's inside and how it functions. The interesting story behind this building is that E.P. Wilbur was the banker on the South Side, a big banker, and he was able to see the transition from the early aspects of Lay's work, because he was the financier. Lay was the architect, and the money is what purchases the land and the materials to build the buildings. So there was this really close bond between E.P. Wilbur, the banker, and A.W. Lay. The significance of this building? Well, when it first was designed, it was 3 floors above the banking room, and as it was erected, a lot of businessmen saw what was going on, and they wanted to have their offices in this building. This was a fireproof building. It was all steel. The vault was solid nickel. It was made at the Bethlehem steel plant and brought over in pieces and then assembled where it is today. If you have a chance to go to this bank, take a look in and you can see all aspects of it. And in fact, in the book, it's relatively detailed. Wachovia gave us permission to go into it and photograph all aspects of it. That was incredible. us to experience that. So when people who needed office space in this area saw what was going on, they wanted to have their offices in this building. So then Lay had to go back to the drawing board and add an extra floor, which is kind of weird because it's already been established what they're going to build. So what he did was he designed an extra floor and actually raised it 20 feet. And the building became actually more grand. When complete, now this is the actual drawing, it's a reproduction of it. So when it was proposed to the city, this is how it would look as opposed to when it really was built and how tall it became. What I'll get to do is important, but how lucky we were to get reproductions of his actual drawings. Put the man's name on them. A drawing of the before, with the 3 floors above the banking building. You get over here and show these folks. Okay, and here we are with the extra floor, which really gave the building prominence. On the top floor of this building, it is vacated. It was the office of the Elks, of which Lay was a member. The Elks had the top floor for about 5 or 6 years, and they moved to a different building. I don't know why, but who took their place was the Bethlehem Business School. And they were up there for quite many years, and eventually went to 3rd Street and New. What is significant about the building, again, is that it's fireproof. And how do we know? The top floor has all flooring removed. When that occurred, we were able to go in and examine what was here. Well, you could see the steel, all of the structures, but in between, on the floor, were hollow bricks. They were terracotta bricks that were hollow. So they were light, but they were fireproof. And when broccoli was raised for the new broccoli, we were able to go in and examine the building to see any secrets it might have had. Well, there was a good secret. No one ever did anything to the custodian's washroom. When we went in, we found the original toilet and sink, all of the china original to the school in 1918. Also, when they started to take the ceilings down, the building was all steel. Again, in between were fireproof buildings, so the building would never burn. And if there was a fire, it would not have been affected. And the same with EP Wilbur Trust. One last thing, that when you look at the work he did from the center back in time, he used a lot of stone. In Allentown, there are examples of his residences where they're very solid and they're stone. But when he comes to 1900, the material is stone, but now his work becomes lighter, whereas it's rather heavy and bulky. And then you see the difference when his residences are built. They become more colonial in style. They're lighter, but he uses windows to allow light into the rooms in a very creative way. I'm going to defer to Pat to take us on the tour of the photos. Now, the photos, please, when you see them, you'll be able to see inside some of the buildings that are here. And like Pat said, everyone we knocked on doors to go in and photograph their residences, they really were very kind to let us actually just take everything. And when you see the interiors, you just wonder, how did we do this? But when they knew what we were trying to accomplish, they opened their doors. So, although we see his timeline here and what the exterior of the buildings are like, the tour then will get us to see the details.
Yeah, I think it was better to start this way, but we'll go upstairs. Okay, we'll go upstairs and then work our way down. So since you've got this background now, so if you want to, of construction, not the construction of ornamentation. And you can see that, I think, even in the bank building. The pictures, the way they were arranged up here is normally we would have started on the first floor and then come up. But since we are up here, the things on this floor, the photos on this floor are intended to show you detail in Lay's work. If you start down here, you can see the fireplace and mantle treatments. He sometimes did just a fireplace or mantle when he was asked to do alterations on a home. And all of the pictures are labeled so you can see which photographer did what. And this is to give you an idea. He was a wood carver to begin with, and you can see the beauty. He worked in a lot of exotic woods. You can see the beauty of the treatment in the panels that he used. And these homes have been restored. And here is one. This is up in Jim Thorpe, the Dreisbach house, which is today a vintage clothing store. And this is I think one of the loveliest capitals. It just kind of, and the photograph just kind of makes you want to reach in and to touch the wood because the grain really pops in this. Here is an example of a floor in the Hirsch House in Allentown. Some of you may know the building. It's near the Allentown Public Library. It is now law offices, and it will show you the very intricate inlay that Lay used in a number of buildings. In the same Hirsch residence, you can see the original sink and the stained glass window that came with it. And also here is a detail from the beautiful tile work that's original to the structure. And here is a detailed look at the stained glass. He loved stained glass, and I think probably the E.P. Wilbur Mansion, which is today attached to the Masonic Temple over in Bethlehem, just as you go over the hill-to-hill bridge, has one of the most beautiful of the domestic stained glass windows commissioned by Lay. Down here, if you want to come along, manufacturing company, and the building is just behind the CVS pharmacy on 4th Street. Almost nobody knows about it. You look across from the Wachovia Bank, and if you see these in color, the blue sky is incredible, and the way John shot them, this is actually going, the brickwork, the seam going up the building. This was a very problematic piece of land to build on, and Lay kind of bent back the building so that he would be able to accommodate the owner. But up to 30 people worked within this structure. Here is another piece of commercial work. This, some of you may know this, and it is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is the Lips and Sutton Silk Mill in Fountain Hill. It's now, I think, a senior citizen apartment complex, and the City Hall is down below. But there is some detail from the office door, and this I find really fascinating. This is on Seneca Street in Fountain Hill, and this is Seneca Street up here, but these little buttresses, you can look down into the brick-paved courtyard. And as Ken was saying about the light, this was really state-of-the-art for the time in which the factory was built. I was thinking of these buildings when they were announcing about it being the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City. That was 1911. And this building was considerably earlier, but I think Lay, as they said, tried to use the most hygienic methods in building. There was good light, good ventilation in building the factory. He did a lot of factories in the area. This is a composite, which John calls Lay Towers, and it's a number of facades showing the towers. This is I'll see a detail later. This is the E.P. Wilbur Trust Company. This is part of the facade of the Charles Schwab Mansion on 3rd Street and Delaware Avenue. This is a detail from one of 7 row homes Lay designed on Cherokee Street. This is part of the facade of the Ombre Studios over at 310 West Broad Street, and this is part of the Main Street Commons. So there are 2, if you want to come up afterwards and look at them, there are 2 details. One is shutters and windows from the Schwab Mansion, and this is the vestibule and the front hallway of Lay's own home on Pawnee Street, 435 Pawnee. So we can go down to Delaware Avenue, and again, there's the Palladian window, the classical columns, and he was very fond of the Richardsonian arches, but he's got this beautiful little detailing. All this woodwork has been uncovered, and there was a bad fire. This is the Lehigh fraternity. There was a bad fire here in the 1990s, but all of that has been restored now on the first floor. I believe the second floor it still looks as it did when Lehigh had it for institutional use. Okay, moving over here, Ken was speaking about the Wilbur Trust Company building and the top floor being vacated. It's vacated at the moment. But when they were looking around, they actually found, John calls this lost king. They found a piece of a playing card in one of the window embrasures, and it tells you that was either from the Elks Club when they were there, or maybe men on their lunch hour who were constructing the building were playing cards, and somehow this got left there for almost 100 years. But it's kind of a metaphor when you look at it. This is one of Ken's and my favorite pictures. You can see the mini I-beams. These are throughout the floor. And the structure is incredibly modern and very, very beautiful, I think. Here is a detail of the nickel vault at the bank, and the bank people were just wonderful. They said you can go anywhere, photograph anything you want to. But the Bethlehem Steel made it, and the people who were the E.P. Wilbur Trust team said they looked throughout the country to find the best vaults and to get the best prices, and they ended up hiring Bethlehem. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's a detail from the granite on the outside of the E.P. Wilbur Trust. And this is where a lot of people stand and wait for the bus at the corner of 4th and Broadway. And it's amazing what the play of light will do. This is one of these nightmare photographs. All of us have had visions like that at some time when we were asleep, I think. But this is a detail from the bronze stairwell in the back. It's if you go to the ATM in the Wachovia building and then go through the door, you will be on the lower, you would be way down here. But this is what it looks like shot from the top. So, excuse me, sorry, Alex. Now we're coming, Robert, please, if you have any comments, let us know. Now we're coming over to some of Robert's real detail work. He and Ken went up to the Jim Thorpe area, and Lay, as I said, was known primarily for his church structures. And these are beautiful with the sky. I'm sure the day must have been incredible when you were shooting this. And the color is extraordinary, but it's interesting when you see some of Lay's earlier churches. There is one particularly, Our Lady Help of Christians in Philadelphia, that has almost the exact same shape. The profile is almost the same, but it's very Gothic, and it's got all kinds of lacy ornamentation on it, but you can see the basic structure. Lay did many of the churches along 4th Street in Bethlehem. You can see the St. Mark's Church, which is now Baptist Church on 4th, the First Reformed, St. Cyril and Methodius, St. John Capistrano. He did alterations to a number of other churches, and these are, I think, among the finest of his structures. This is the house built for banker John Dreisbach in Jim Thorpe, or Mauchunk as it was called at the time. This wonderful, soft, rosy brick. As Ken said, Lay was able to solve design problems when he had extremely small fields in which to work. We saw the original plans for this in Philadelphia, and I think it's only 7 feet across. And he actually has things down to the gold and white trim that he wanted in the various rooms. They're amazingly detailed. Today, this is a vintage clothing shop. This is the interior of that the alcove, the bay, and you can see a fireplace, and you can see looking out across the street. It's very small, and yet it has this wonderful feeling of detail. This, as Ken says, is the primitive air conditioning with the Dutch door, but you could close this on the bottom but open this in the summer. There are transoms, so the air could go up and down and ventilate the house. So again, with Lay, the beauty is in the details. Okay, we can now go down to the first section. That's okay. Okay, starting over here, this, as I was saying before, this is the E.P. Wilbur Senior Mansion, which is today part of the Masonic Temple complex in Bethlehem. And again, this is the project that got Ken started on everything. You can see the beautiful detail, fireplace, woodwork, and that stained glass window. And I know you want to tell a lot of people think that this is...
Well, a lot of individuals in town mistaken this window as a Tiffany, because Tiffany had some work at Lehigh, but not as much as people think. The rotunda at the Linderman Library was, the glass was done by a firm in New York State. But this stained glass was done by
Benjamin Sellers, who had worked for Tiffany.
He worked for Tiffany,
I think
so
that's where the confusion came.
exactly. It wasn't a Tiffany window, but he worked for Tiffany, so the work was somewhat similar. There were a pair of these, and one was stolen many years ago, so that's the only one that remains. This room was added on for E.P. Wilbur Sr. As his billiard room, and the fireplace showed 3 scallop shells, and that is the same device that he asked Lay to put at the top of the E.P. Wilbur Trust building.
Which we'll see down here.
Yeah, and there's a detail of the shell.
This is one of the most beautiful things as far as woodwork is concerned. This is sycamore, and this is the alcove in the law offices. I think it's the corner of 12th or 13th and Hamilton Streets in Allentown. This is a detail from one of those 2 houses over in the Mount Airy section. You can see Moravian tiles in the fireplace, on the front of the fireplace. And there's just the very, very beautiful molding and fireplace itself. Very, very classical. It's one of my favorite pictures. Iconic picture because it's been seen in so many newspaper articles about the Lay project. This is what Ken was telling you about the stylized scallop shell, which seems to be the emblem of the Wilbur family. And the stylized tassels. It's almost as though you're a bird flying right up. You have to realize this is at the very, very top of the bank building. Here is a wonderful fishbowl view of the banking room itself, taken from the front door. It was very nice. When Wachovia took over, they made the commitment that they would restore the banking room to its original splendor. If anybody bank there in the 1980s, early 90s, the ceilings had all been dropped. There was wall-to-wall carpet covering the marble floors. It looked nothing like this. And suddenly they uncovered the windows, they re-gilded all of the little cornices and things, and it's really beautiful. Some of the radiator screens, I believe, were made by Tiffany. And you can go in. They said a lot of people come in the bank now just to look at the architectural features. This is, again, one of our favorite pictures. This shows you the open space on the top of the top floor of the bank, and it commanded views. Yeah, this obviously wasn't here in Lay's time. There are the blast furnaces out the window. This building was supposed to be the flagship of South Bethlehem commerce in the second decade of the 20th century. Here is another view from the top floor, and this looks out at some of Benedict Burkle homes around Burkle Avenue, Montclair Avenue. Ahart's Market would be right over here, and there is Brockle Middle School shortly before it was raised in 2009. So I think that pretty much does it for the pictures, but if anybody has questions, would like to, we have brochures. We also have posters that don't have printing on the back and that can be framed, and it's got a reproduction of the timeline from upstairs. So thank you all for coming, and if you've got any questions, please let us know. Okay.
It's meant to influence and what I need to do is populate when he has
Okay, I got to be reading. Okay, yes, sir.
Right.
And you wouldn't think it, but it is.
Yeah,
I never forgot.
and then there's really big school in Texas. Primary school, the folks. So, yeah, they would have to. And so, you know, it just meant that different people do different things. Yeah. Really. It's like the number of years they saw me. And they saw me wobbling and jumped back into the truck. And I don't see anything that would go out and look at the term history table.
They did wrong.
You know, I live above Smoky Mountain. And if you go down.
Because I'm, you know, like for terms that they did it at those schools.
It was in the 80s.
So I'm afraid that if we do things in an automated way, that it's going to run them. Because I can't see how it works.
All that.
I want to go over there so I can between a zero term. That's how I feel.
Oh, really? Oh, so then they're term one.
Is that they're academically and they were juniors.
They like that. Timeline is, okay, I'll print out one of the, timeline is on the measure.
You have to see the 40 feet, it looks a lot different.
The timeline is really cool. So the outside.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Faye glanced at me. My father.